Sometimes the world moves on without you, and you learn to live with being left behind. Margaret Lane understood that feeling at 34, unwed, watching her younger sisters marry into wealth while she tended a crumbling estate and endured the whispers of a small Texas town. She'd made peace with her place in life, or so she believed. Then Elias Crowe arrived, the most powerful cattle baron in Texas. A man who'd never knelt for anyone, came for business about land rights. What he found was a woman who didn't need his money, didn't fear his reputation, and lived by her own rules. What happens when the proudest cowboy in Texas can't stop thinking about the woman everyone else forgot? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Lane estate sat at the edge of Mercer County like a grand old dowager who'd seen better days and knew it. The house itself was a two-story Victorian with wraparound porches that creaked in the wind, white paint peeling in long strips that curled away from the wood like old parchment. Margaret had learned to ignore the deterioration, the way one learns to ignore an aching tooth. Acknowledge it, but don't dwell on it, because dwelling changes nothing when you haven't the money to fix it. She stood on the front porch that October morning, coffee cup warming her hands, watching the sun break over the eastern fields. The land stretched out before her in rolling waves of brown and gold, most of it lying fallow now. 200 acres that had once supported cotton and cattle, now reduced to a kitchen garden, a small chicken coop. And memories of what her father had built before the drought of '09 took everything but the dirt itself. The family portrait hung in the front parlor, behind glass that Margaret cleaned every Sunday without fail. Her mother had commissioned it the year before she died. Margaret, at 16, standing behind her seated parents, her hand resting on her mother's shoulder. Her 3 younger sisters arranged on either side, all of them in their Sunday best, all of them still believing the Lane name meant something in Mercer County. That was 18 years ago. Now the frame was the most valuable thing left in the house. Margaret's father, Thomas Lane, sat in his study most days, surrounded by ledgers he no longer opened and land deeds he couldn't bear to sell. He was 68, still tall and broad-shouldered, but time and loss had carved him hollow. He spoke little these days, just sat by the window watching the empty fields as if expecting something to change if he watched long enough. Her youngest sister, Caroline, had married first, at 19, to a banker's son from Dallas. The wedding had cleaned out what remained of their savings, but her father had insisted. "A Lane daughter deserves a proper send-off," he'd said, even as the creditors circled. Margaret had made Caroline's dress herself, sitting up 3 nights in a row with needle and thread, her fingers cramping around the delicate work. Then went Elizabeth, at 21, to a lawyer in Houston. Another expensive wedding, another departure. Margaret was 28 by then, and the whispers had already started in town. "Poor Margaret," they'd say, as if she couldn't hear. Such a shame. Not ugly, mind you, but so serious. So practical. Men don't want practical, they want pretty and sweet. Margaret learned not to listen. She learned to keep her head down, to manage the household accounts with precision that would have impressed any banker, to negotiate with merchants and creditors with a steel spine her sisters never developed. She learned that being forgotten had its advantages. People told her things they wouldn't tell someone they thought mattered. The middle sister, Josephine, had held out until 23, but even she'd eventually married. A cotton broker from San Antonio, with money enough to make her comfortable and boring enough to make her miserable. Margaret saw it in Josephine's eyes at the wedding, that flicker of regret, but by then it was too late. Josephine had wanted security, and security was what she got. That left Margaret. At 34, alone with their father and Mrs. Chen, the elderly housekeeper who'd stayed on despite not being paid regularly for 2 years. Mrs. Chen had come from San Francisco with her late husband during the railroad boom, and when he died, she'd needed work. Margaret's mother had hired her, and Mrs. Chen had never left, even when leaving would have been the sensible thing. "You should have married young," Mrs. Chen said sometimes, not unkindly. "Should have gone when you had the chance." Margaret had received offers, of course. 3 proposals before she was 25. But one had been from a man who drank too much, another from a man who wanted her father's land more than he wanted her, and the third from a schoolteacher who was kind enough, but who made her feel absolutely nothing when he spoke. She'd turned them all down, and her father had supported her each time, even as the estate crumbled around them. Better alone than poorly matched, he'd told her after the third refusal. Your mother would have said the same. Her mother. Margaret remembered her in fragments now, the scent of rosewater, the sound of humming while working in the garden, the firm but gentle hands that had braided Margaret's hair each morning. Cancer had taken her slow and mean, and by the end, Margaret had been the one doing the nursing, the cleaning, the sitting up through the long nights. She'd been 23, and she'd learned then what she was made of. The town of Mercer itself was small and weathered, built around a central square, with a courthouse, a general store, a church, and a handful of other buildings that served the surrounding ranches. Population barely topped 400, and everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. Margaret went to town twice a week for supplies, exchanged pleasantries, conducted her business, and left. She learned that being polite but distant kept the pity at bay. She kept the estate running through sheer determination and creative accounting. There was a tenant farmer, Ben Morrison, who worked 20 acres on shares. He got 2/3 of whatever he could grow. She got 1/3. It wasn't much, but it kept them in flour and beans. She sold eggs in town, took in mending work, though she told no one, and had quietly sold off her mother's jewelry piece by piece over the years to pay the property taxes. The house itself was too large for 3 people and too expensive to heat properly in winter. They'd closed off most of the upstairs rooms, and Margaret had moved her father's bedroom to the ground floor when climbing stairs became difficult for him. Her own room was small, formerly a storage room, but it had a good window facing east, and it was warm enough with extra quilts. She read in the evenings, books from her father's library, mostly histories and literature. Occasionally, a novel borrowed from the town's small collection. She played the piano in the front parlor, the instrument out of tune, but still functional, working through pieces her mother had taught her. Bach, mostly. Chopin when she felt melancholy. She found comfort in the structure of music, the way notes followed rules and made sense. Her daily routine had a rhythm to it that she found soothing. Up at dawn, feed the chickens, collect eggs, make breakfast for her father and Mrs. Chen. Morning chores, mending, cleaning, paperwork. Lunch, then afternoon work in the garden when weather permitted, or inside work when it didn't. Dinner at 6, always at the table with her father, even though he barely spoke. Evening reading, then bed by 9. It was a small life, but it was hers, and she'd made peace with it. The neighboring ranches had slowly consolidated over the years. The Hendersons to the north had sold out 5 years back. The Pritchards to the south had lost their place to the bank in 11. The Morrison farm to the east was hanging on by a thread. And to the west, across a stretch of scrubland that had once been prime grazing, lay the beginnings of what people were calling the Crowe Empire. Margaret had heard of Elias Crowe long before she met him. Everyone had. He'd appeared in Texas 7 years ago with money from back east. Railroad money, some said, or cattle money from Wyoming, or oil money from his family, depending on who was telling the story. What everyone agreed on was that he had money, he had ambition, and he was buying up land at a pace that made the old ranching families nervous. The Crowe Ranch now stretched across 40,000 acres, ran 10,000 head of cattle, and employed half the able-bodied men in 3 counties. Crowe himself was rarely seen in town. He had managers for that, but when he did appear, he commanded attention without saying much. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dark hair going grey at the temples, though he was only 36. He had a reputation for being fair but hard, generous with his men, but ruthless with his competitors. Margaret had never expected him to notice the Lane estate. They had nothing he'd want, just 200 acres of worn-out land and a house held together by pride and peeling paint. But 3 weeks ago, A letter had arrived, delivered by one of Crowe's men, requesting a meeting to discuss matters of mutual interest regarding property boundaries and water rights. Margaret had read the letter 3 times, then consulted the old survey maps in her father's study. There was a spring on the western edge of their property, she discovered, that fed into a creek running through Crowe's land. In wet years, it didn't matter, but this was the 3rd year of drought, and water was becoming precious. She'd written back, formal and brief, agreeing to a meeting. That was 2 weeks ago, and she'd heard nothing since, until this morning, when Mrs. Chen had come to find her in the garden, slightly out of breath, to announce that Mr. Elias Crowe himself was riding up the drive. Margaret set down her coffee cup and watched him approach. He rode a big bay gelding, sitting easy in the saddle like a man who'd grown up on horseback. He was dressed for work. Good boots, worn jeans, a work shirt rolled to the elbows, a hat that had seen weather. No suit, no pretense. She appreciated that. She watched him dismount, tie his horse to the porch rail, and look up at the house with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not pity, exactly. Something more like assessment, the way you'd look at a piece of furniture and consider whether it could be restored or was too far gone. He removed his hat as he climbed the porch steps, and she got her first close look at him. The photographs in the county newspaper hadn't done him justice. He had a strong face, weathered by sun and wind, with grey eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. There was a scar along his jaw, thin and white, old enough to have been there years. Miss Lane, he said, and his voice was deeper than she'd expected, with a trace of something Eastern in the vowels. I apologize for arriving unannounced. I should have sent word ahead. You sent a letter 2 weeks ago, Margaret said, keeping her tone level. I assumed that was sufficient announcement. He smiled slightly at that, just a quirk at the corner of his mouth. Fair point, may I? He gestured to one of the porch chairs. Of course. Would you like coffee? It's fresh. I would, thank you. She went inside to fetch another cup, and when she returned, he'd settled into the chair her father usually occupied, looking out over the fields the same way her father did. For a moment it struck her as presumptuous, but then she reconsidered. Maybe he was just seeing what she saw, the potential in land that had been neglected too long. She handed him the coffee and took her own chair. They sat in silence for a moment, and she waited. Let him speak first. Let him show his hand. You have a spring on the western edge of your property, he said finally. Feeds into Possum Creek. I'm aware. In dry years, it's the primary source for that creek. The creek runs through my north pastures for about 3 miles before joining with the Brazos tributary. Also aware. He glanced at her, and she saw something like amusement in his eyes. You've done your research. I tend to know what I own, Mr. Crowe. Please, call me Elias, and I'll call you Margaret, if you don't mind. Formality seems unnecessary between neighbors. She inclined her head slightly. Neighbors. That's what he'd said. Not landowners, not buyer and seller, neighbors. I came to discuss terms, he continued. I'd like to secure water rights to that spring, and I'm prepared to offer fair compensation. I'm not interested in selling. I'm not asking to buy. I'm proposing a lease agreement. You retain ownership. I get access during drought years. You get guaranteed income. Margaret sipped her coffee, considering. What kind of guaranteed income? $500 a year, payable quarterly, in perpetuity, as long as the Crowe Ranch operates. It was a generous offer, more than generous. $500 a year would pay the property taxes, cover basic repairs, keep food on the table with money left over. It was enough to matter, enough to make a difference, which meant there was something she wasn't seeing. Why? She asked. Why what? Why offer so much for access to one spring? There are other water sources, deeper wells. The Brazos itself is only 12 miles south. Elias set his coffee cup down and leaned back in his chair, studying her with those grey eyes. Because I'd rather deal with you than fight you. Because I've seen what happens when neighbors go to war over water, and it's not pretty. because 500 a year is nothing compared to what I'd lose if that creek runs dry and I have to drive cattle 12 miles south every day. And because—" he paused, seemed to reconsider his words, "because I get the sense you're the kind of person who honors an agreement once made." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. "I'll need to think about it," Margaret said, "and discuss it with my father." "Of course. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." He stood, and she stood with him. He was tall. She had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, and she was not a short woman. "Thank you for the coffee," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "And for hearing me out. Thank you for being direct." He smiled again, more fully this time. "Something tells me you don't have much patience for anything else." He was right about that. But she didn't say so. She just watched him mount his horse and ride back down the drive, dust rising behind him in the dry autumn air. Mrs. Chen appeared at her elbow, silent as a cat. "Interesting man. He wants water rights." "Did he offer to buy the whole place?" "No, just a lease for the spring." "Generous?" "Very. So why are you frowning?" Margaret turned to look at the older woman. "Because generous men usually want something more than what they're asking for." Mrs. Chen patted her arm. "Or maybe some men are just generous. Don't borrow trouble, child. God knows you have enough of your own." Margaret went back inside to tell her father about the offer, but part of her mind was still on the porch, still watching Elias Crowe ride away, still trying to figure out what it was about him that unsettled her so much. It wasn't until later that night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, that she realized what it was. He'd looked at her the way men used to look at her sisters, with interest, with attention, like she was someone worth seeing, and she didn't know what to do with that at all. 3 days after Elias Crowe's visit, Margaret's father had a stroke. She found him in his study, slumped in his chair, the right side of his face slack, his right hand curled useless in his lap. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the terrible certainty that she was watching him die. Then training took over, years of nursing her mother, years of keeping calm when everything fell apart. She sent Mrs. Chen running for Doc Pritchard in town while she got her father onto the floor, loosened his collar, turned his head to the side. She held his good hand and talked to him, steady and low, telling him to hold on, telling him help was coming, telling him she was right here. Doc Pritchard arrived 40 minutes later, examined him with the efficiency of 40 years' practice, and delivered the news Margaret had already known in her bones. Stroke, significant. Her father would live, probably, but the right side was paralyzed and there was no telling how much function he'd recover. He'd need constant care. Weeks, maybe months, maybe forever. The doctor left laudanum for the pain, and instructions for Margaret, and then he was gone, leaving her with her father in a bed he might never leave. The first 3 days were the hardest. Her father drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes confused, sometimes trying to speak and producing only garbled sounds that frustrated him to tears. Margaret slept in a chair beside his bed, waking at every sound, changing sheets when he couldn't make it to the chamber pot in time, spooning broth into his mouth when he could swallow. Mrs. Chen took over the running of the house completely, but even with her help, Margaret felt herself stretching thin. There was her father, there were the chickens, there was the garden, there were the accounts, there was the correspondence, with creditors who wouldn't wait just because she had a crisis. On the 4th day, Caroline sent a telegram from Dallas, brief, impersonal, heard about father, cannot travel at present, expecting 3rd child, send updates. C. Elizabeth's telegram arrived the same day, equally brief. Father, ill, regret, cannot leave Houston. Trial preparations, wire if dire. E. Josephine didn't send anything at all. Margaret stood in the Western Union office in town, reading those strips of paper, and felt something cold and final settle in her chest. Her sisters had moved on. They'd married, built new lives, new families, and the Lane estate had become something they'd left behind, a place they'd visit in memory but never in person. She was alone in this. She'd always known it, but seeing it confirmed in telegraph code made it real in a way that hollowed her out. She walked home because she'd sold the horse 2 months ago and couldn't afford the livery to rent one. 4 miles. In November cold, the telegram strips crumpled in her coat pocket, her breath making clouds in the air. When she got back, there was a man on her porch. Elias Crowe stood with his hat in his hands, and when he turned at the sound of her footsteps, his face showed something she hadn't seen there before: concern. "I heard about your father," he said without preamble. "I'm sorry." Margaret stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, suddenly aware of how she must look, exhausted, disheveled, her dress spotted with stains she didn't want to identify. "Thank you. How is he?" "Alive. For now." Elias descended the steps until he was standing level with her. Up close, she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes. The grey threaded more heavily through his hair than she'd noticed before. "What do you need?" The question caught her off guard. Not "what can I do to help?" or "let me know if there's anything you need." The polite, meaningless phrases people offered when they didn't want to actually help. "Just what do you need, direct and plain." "I don't," she started, then stopped. What did she need? Everything, nothing. Things no one could give her. "I need time," she said finally. "I need my father to recover. I need my sisters to give a damn. I need—" She stopped again, feeling the words pile up in her throat, dangerous and close to breaking. "The water rights," Elias said quietly. "I can wait on that. As long as you need. I can't think about that right now. I know. I'm saying you don't have to. The offer stands whenever you're ready." Margaret looked at him, trying to read his angle, trying to see the catch. But his face showed nothing but honest concern, and that was somehow worse than if he'd been calculating. She could handle calculation. She didn't know how to handle genuine kindness from a man who had no reason to give it. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Because I heard you were walking home from town." "So?" "So it's 4 miles, and it's cold, and you've been up for 4 days straight taking care of your father." "I brought the wagon." He nodded toward the end of the drive, where she could now see a buckboard hitched to 2 horses. A young man sitting in the driver's seat. "I'm already home. I can see that. But I've got supplies in the wagon. Food, mostly. Some other things that might help. Mrs. Chen gave me a list." "Mrs. Chen, when did you—" "I stopped by yesterday. You were with your father. She mentioned you were running low on some things, so I went to the general store and put it on my account." Consider it a neighborly gesture. Margaret felt her temper flare, hot and sudden. "I don't need charity. It's not charity. I don't care what you call it. We're not destitute. We can pay our own way. I know you can. But right now you're stretched thin, and accepting help doesn't make you weak, Margaret. It makes you practical." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him to take his supplies and his pity and leave. But the truth was, she did need food. She'd been rationing eggs to make them last, watering down the soup, skipping meals so her father and Mrs. Chen could eat properly. Pride was expensive, and right now she couldn't afford it. "Fine," she said, the word coming out sharp. "Bring the supplies inside. But I'm keeping track of what you spend, and I'll pay you back when I can." "Fair enough." The young man, one of Crowe's ranch hands, Margaret assumed, helped unload the wagon. There was flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salt pork, eggs, butter, a sack of potatoes, canned goods, fresh bread, and incongruously, a jar of honey. "The honey's from Mrs. Chen's list," Elias said when he saw Margaret looking at it. "Said your father used to like it in his tea." Something in Margaret's chest cracked at that, Mrs. Chen remembering that detail, Elias taking the trouble to include it. She turned away quickly, busying herself with putting things in the pantry, blinking hard against the sudden sting in her eyes. When everything was unloaded, Elias stood in the kitchen, hat in hand again, looking like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "Thank you," Margaret said, because manners were ingrained deep even when everything else was falling apart. It was kind of you. Not kind, neighborly. He put his hat on. "I meant what I said. The water rights can wait. And if you need anything else, anything at all, you send word. I'm not offering charity, Margaret. I'm offering help because I can, and you need it. There's no shame in that." After he left, Margaret stood in the pantry, surrounded by supplies she hadn't had to beg or borrow or scrimp for. and finally let herself cry. That night, sitting beside her father's bed while he slept, Margaret pulled out the water rights contract Elias had left during his first visit. She'd read it a dozen times already, looking for loopholes, looking for traps. It was straightforward, almost suspiciously so. $500 a year, paid quarterly, for access to the spring during drought years. No strings attached, no hidden clauses. Just a fair exchange for a resource she had, and he needed. She could sign it now. Should sign it now. $500 a year would cover the doctor's bills, pay for proper food, maybe even hire someone to help with her father's care. But signing it felt like giving up something she couldn't quite name. Independence, maybe. The idea that she could make it on her own, that she didn't need anyone's help, except she did need help. That was the truth she'd been avoiding for months, maybe years. The estate was failing. Her father was dying by degrees, and she was drowning in responsibilities she couldn't manage alone. Her father stirred in the bed, made a sound, not quite a word, but close. She leaned in, took his good hand. "It's all right," she told him, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to him or herself. "We're going to be all right." She didn't believe it, but she said it anyway. Because sometimes saying the thing makes it easier to imagine it might be true. In the morning, she would ride out to the Crowe ranch, borrow a horse from Morrison if she had to, and sign the contract. In the morning, she would do what needed doing, the way she'd always done. But tonight, sitting in the dark with her father's labored breathing, the only sound, Margaret Lane let herself admit that she was tired. Tired of holding everything together. Tired of being the one people forgot about until they needed something. Tired of living small and making do. And she let herself admit something else. Too. Something that scared her more than the failing estate or her father's illness or the empty telegrams from her sisters. When Elias Crowe looked at her, she didn't feel forgotten, and she didn't know if that was a gift or a danger. Margaret rode to the Crowe ranch 3 days later on a borrowed mare that belonged to Ben Morrison. The animal was old and slow, but steady, and Margaret was grateful for both qualities. She hadn't ridden in 2 years, and her body reminded her of that fact with every step the horse took. The Crowe ranch began 5 miles west of the Lane estate, marked by a stone archway with an iron sign overhead, a simple brand in the shape of a crow in flight. The drive stretched another 2 miles beyond that, winding through rolling grassland where cattle grazed in groups that seemed to go on forever. She'd never seen so many cattle in one place. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, fat and healthy, despite the drought that had devastated smaller operations. Crowe had clearly invested in good breeding stock and better management. Everything she passed looked well maintained. Fences in good repair, water troughs full. Even the grass seemed greener here, as if prosperity itself could change the color of the earth. The main house surprised her. She'd expected something ostentatious, a monument to wealth and power. Instead, she found a sprawling ranch house built from local stone and timber, functional and handsome without being flashy. Wide porches, large windows, a roof that looked solid enough to last another 100 years. It looked like a home where people actually lived, not a showpiece. A man approached as she dismounted, older, weathered, with a limp that suggested an old injury. "Help you, ma'am?" "Margaret Lane. I'm here to see Mr. Crowe." "He's in the office. I'll take you through." The interior matched the exterior, well-built, well-maintained, but unpretentious. Hardwood floors, simple furniture that looked comfortable rather than decorative, walls lined with maps and ledgers instead of portraits. This was a working ranch, run by someone who understood that flash meant nothing if the foundation wasn't solid. The man led her to a room at the back of the house and knocked once. "Mr. Crowe, Miss Lane to see you." "Send her in." The office was large, dominated by a desk covered in paperwork and maps. Elias stood when she entered, and she saw surprise flicker across his face, quickly masked, but there. "Margaret, I wasn't expecting you. I came to sign the contract. If the offer still stands." "Of course it does. Please sit." He gestured to a chair across from his desk, then moved some papers aside, uncovering a document she recognized, the water rights agreement. "I have it right here." "Are you sure?" I told you there was no rush. I'm sure. He studied her for a moment, then nodded and turned the contract around so she could read it. Take your time. Make sure you understand every clause. She read it again, carefully, even though she'd memorized it already. The terms were exactly as he'd stated. Fair, straightforward, no hidden surprises. At the bottom was a line for her signature and a line for his. I'll need to witness your father's signature as well, Elias said, since the property is in his name. Margaret looked up from the document. My father can't sign anything. He can barely hold a spoon. I see. Elias leaned back in his chair, thinking. Do you have power of attorney? No. Then legally, we have a problem. Margaret felt her stomach sink. She should have anticipated this. Should have thought it through, but she'd been so focused on getting here, on swallowing her pride enough to accept help, that she hadn't considered the legal realities. There must be a way, she said. The property isn't going anywhere. The spring isn't going anywhere. You need the water, I need the money. There has to be a solution. There is. You get power of attorney from a judge. Doc Pritchard testifies to your father's condition. You make the case that someone needs to be able to manage his affairs, and the judge grants you legal authority to act on his behalf. It'll take a week, maybe 2. I don't have 2 weeks. The property taxes are due in 30 days, and I'm already behind on... She stopped, not wanting to reveal just how desperate their situation was. But Elias didn't look smug or satisfied at her admission. He looked thoughtful. I could advance you the first year's payment now. Consider it a good faith gesture. You get the power of attorney, we make it official, and the contract stands as written. That's... Margaret started to refuse automatically, then caught herself. That's generous. That's more than fair. That's exactly what she needed. Why would you do that? Because I need the water rights secured before next spring, and you need money now. This benefits both of us. Or it puts me in your debt. Not debt, agreement. There's a difference. He pulled out his checkbook and began writing. $500, first payment of 4. The other 3 come after we formalize the contract. He tore out the check and held it across the desk. Margaret stared at it, at the careful handwriting, at the amount that could solve so many immediate problems. Taking it felt like stepping off a cliff. Trusting there'd be ground underneath, she took the check. Thank you, she said, and meant it. You're welcome. Elias capped his pen. Now, while you're here, I wanted to discuss something else. A proposition that's separate from the water rights. Margaret tensed. Here it came, the real ask, the hidden agenda. I need someone to manage my household accounts, Elias continued. My current bookkeeper is competent enough with ranch finances, but he's drowning in receipts and ledgers for the house and personal expenses. I need someone with an eye for detail and a head for numbers. Mrs. Chen mentioned you'd been managing your estate's finances for years. Mrs. Chen has been talking to you? We've had a few conversations. She's worried about you. Don't be angry with her, she's just looking out for you. Margaret set that aside to be irritated about later. What exactly are you proposing? Come here twice a week. Go through the household accounts, organize them, make sure everything's properly recorded and filed. 3 hours each visit, say Tuesday and Friday mornings. I'll pay $50 a month. $50 a month. $600 a year, combined with the water rights payment. That was $1,100 annually, more money than the estate had seen in 5 years. Why me? Margaret asked. You could hire someone from town. Someone with actual experience keeping books professionally, because everyone in town either works for me or wants to work for me, and I don't need my personal finances becoming public gossip. You, on the other hand, have no reason to spread my business around, and you need work you can do without leaving your father unattended for too long. Morrison's girl could sit with him for a few hours twice a week. I've already spoken to her father, and she's willing. He'd thought it through, anticipated her objections, found solutions before she'd even raised the problems. You've put considerable thought into this, Margaret said carefully. I have. Why? Elias stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out over his land. When I came to Texas 7 years ago, I had money but no reputation. People didn't trust me. Thought I was some eastern dandy come to play at ranching. I had to prove I was serious, that I understood the work, that I respected the land and the people who'd been working it long before I showed up. He turned back to face her. You're in a different situation, but the principle's the same. You need to prove you can hold on to that estate, that you're not just waiting for it to fall apart so you can sell to the highest bidder. Taking help doesn't make you weak, Margaret, but taking it and making something of it that proves you're strong enough to deserve it. It was the most he'd said about himself since she'd met him, and something about the honesty of it disarmed her. I'll do it, she said. The bookkeeping. But I'm keeping my own hours, and if my father needs me, I leave regardless of whether the work is done. Agreed, and I want it in writing. A proper employment contract. I'll have one drawn up by tomorrow. He extended his hand across the desk. We have an agreement? Margaret looked at his hand, strong, calloused, the hand of someone who worked for what he had. She thought about her own hands, roughened by work and worry, and realized they weren't so different. She shook his hand. His grip was firm but not crushing, and he held on just a moment longer than necessary, his grey eyes meeting hers. We have an agreement, she said, walking back to the borrowed mare, check and employment promise in her pocket. Margaret felt something unfamiliar, hope, maybe, or just the absence of the constant weight of fear that had pressed down on her for so long. Mrs. Chen was right. Some men were just generous, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that Elias Crowe's generosity came with something unspoken, something neither of them had named yet, and she couldn't decide if that thought thrilled her or terrified her. Margaret started work at the Crowe Ranch the following Tuesday. Morrison's daughter, Lucy, a quiet girl of 17 with a gentle manner, arrived at 8 to sit with Margaret's father, and Margaret rode out under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The household account ledgers were worse than she'd expected. Bills stuffed between pages, receipts crumpled in drawers, entries made haphazardly with no clear system. Whoever had been managing this before had no sense of organization whatsoever. She spent the first hour just sorting through the chaos, creating piles, paid bills, unpaid bills, receipts that needed recording, correspondence that required response. Elias left her alone to work, which she appreciated. She heard him moving through the house occasionally, heard voices as ranch hands came and went with reports or questions. But he didn't interrupt. By the end of 3 hours, she'd made a reasonable dent in the mess and had outlined a system for moving forward. She found Elias in his office, going over what looked like breeding records. I'm heading back, she told him. I've organized what was there and started a new ledger system. Should have everything properly recorded within 2 weeks if the current volume continues. He looked up from his papers. That bad? Whoever was keeping these books before should not be allowed near financial documents. That would be me. Margaret blinked. Oh, I'm good with cattle and land and people. Numbers on paper just, he gestured vaguely, don't seem to stick in my head the way they should. I can do basic math fine, but tracking expenses and receipts and all the rest of it, I've never had the knack. I see. Tell me honestly. How bad is it? She considered softening the truth, then decided he'd asked for honesty. You've been overpaying for at least half your supplies. 3 different merchants have been billing you for goods never delivered, and your housekeeper has been skimming, not much, but consistently, maybe $50 over the past 6 months. Elias's expression hardened at the last point. You're certain? I'd stake my reputation on it. The entries are small enough to miss if you're not looking carefully, but the pattern is clear. Show me. She led him through the evidence. Small discrepancies. Always on days when the housekeeper would have had access to the cash box. Always in amounts just under what would trigger suspicion. Elias studied the ledger in silence, jaw tight. I hired her because her husband worked for me and died in a stampede 3 years back, he said finally. Felt obligated to take care of her. Obligation doesn't excuse theft. No, it doesn't. He closed the ledger. Thank you for catching this. I'll handle it today. You'll need to hire a replacement. I know someone in town who might work. Wife of one of my hands. Good woman, honest. I'll speak to her, Margaret nodded. It wasn't her business how he managed his household staff, but she felt obscurely pleased that he'd acted so decisively. Some men would have made excuses, let it slide because confrontation was uncomfortable. "One other thing," she said. "You're sitting on at least 2 months of unpaid invoices. Some of these merchants have been waiting 90 days or more. That's not good for your reputation. I thought bills were being paid. They were being recorded as paid." "Different thing." Elias rubbed his face, suddenly looking tired. "Fix it. Pay whatever needs paying. Send me a summary when you're done, so I know where we stand. That'll require access to your bank accounts. I'll write you a letter of authorization for the bank in town. Pick it up Friday when you come back." It was a remarkable amount of trust to place in someone he'd known less than a month. "Margaret said as much. Mrs. Chen vouched for you," Elias said simply. "That's enough for me." On the ride home, Margaret found herself thinking about that, about how much weight he'd given to Mrs. Chen's opinion, about how quickly he'd trusted Margaret with information that could ruin him if she chose to use it maliciously. Either he was a very good judge of character or a very poor one. She couldn't decide which. Her father was awake when she got back, sitting up in bed with Lucy reading to him from the county newspaper. He looked better than he had in days, color in his face, his eyes tracking the words even if he couldn't speak them. "Miss Lane," Lucy said, standing. "He's been very good. Ate all his lunch and took his medicine without fuss." "Thank you, Lucy. I'll see you Friday, same time." "Yes, ma'am." After the girl left, Margaret sat beside her father's bed. He reached for her hand with his good one, squeezed it. "Crowe," he managed to say, the words slurred but recognizable. "I've taken work with him. Just bookkeeping, twice a week." "It's good money, Papa." He frowned, tried to say something else, couldn't manage it. The frustration that crossed his face nearly broke her heart. "It's all right," she told him. "We're going to be all right now. I promise." He held her hand and looked at her with eyes that were still sharp despite the broken body housing them. She wondered what he saw, his eldest daughter, 34 and unwed, taking work from a man everyone said was too powerful for his own good. Did he worry? Did he approve? Did he see what she was starting to see? That Elias Crowe was more than just his reputation. That night, Margaret went through her mother's old recipe book, a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten instructions for everything from bread to preserves to medicinal tonics. Her mother had been methodical about documenting things, had believed in leaving clear instructions for whoever came after. Margaret found the recipe for honey cake on page 47. Her mother's handwriting, steady and clear, Thomas's favorite. "Use good honey, don't skimp on the butter." She decided to make one for her father. The kitchen was cold, but she heated it up with the cook stove and worked by lamplight, measuring and mixing, following her mother's instructions exactly. The motions were soothing: crack eggs, cream butter, fold in flour. Simple tasks with predictable results. While the cake baked, she sat at the kitchen table and made a list of everything that needed doing at the estate. Repairs to the roof before winter, new chickens in spring, fence mending in the south pasture, taxes in 3 weeks, doctor's bills, Mrs. Chen's wages. She'd been putting off that conversation, but the woman deserved to be paid. With the money from Elias, she could do it all. Could catch up, could get ahead. Could stop living month to month, crisis to crisis. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it brought an uneasy awareness that her life was becoming entangled with Elias Crowe's in ways she hadn't anticipated. She was working for him, leasing to him, depending on him. If he decided to withdraw his support, she'd be worse off than before, because now she'd know what it felt like to have breathing room, and losing it would hurt more than never having it at all. When the cake came out of the oven, golden and smelling of honey and butter, she cut a piece for her father and brought it to him on her mother's good china. He smiled when he saw it, a crooked smile because of the paralysis, but genuine. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, and when he finished, he squeezed her hand again. "Good," he said. Just that one word, but it was enough. Margaret kissed his forehead and took the plate back to the kitchen. She wrapped the rest of the cake in cheesecloth and set it in the pantry. Tomorrow she'd take a slice to Mrs. Chen as thanks for all the extra work she'd been doing. And maybe she'd take a piece to Elias on Friday, as a thank you for the employment, for the trust, for seeing her as someone worth taking a chance on. Or maybe that was too forward, too personal, too much like something her sisters would do, using baked goods as currency in a relationship she didn't fully understand. She decided to wait and see, to take things as they came, to be practical and careful, and not read too much into a business arrangement. But lying in bed that night, she thought about the way Elias had looked at her when he'd said, "Mrs. Chen vouched for you. That's enough for me." Like trust was something simple, something easily given to someone who'd earned it. She'd spent so long being overlooked that being seen felt dangerous, and she still couldn't decide if the danger was to her heart or just her pride. 6 weeks into the arrangement, Margaret received a letter from Josephine. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick cream-colored paper with expensive postage. Addressed in her sister's careful script, Margaret set it aside while she tended to her father, then opened it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee grown cold. The letter was 3 pages long, full of news about Josephine's life in San Antonio, parties attended, dresses purchased, the new furniture for the parlor. Nothing about their father beyond a cursory, "I hope he's improving." Nothing about the estate, about Margaret's situation, about whether she might visit. Just page after page of trivial details about a life Margaret had no part in. The real purpose became clear on the 3rd page. "Arthur and I have been discussing the estate. We both agree that maintaining it is becoming impractical. Papa is failing, and you cannot manage it alone indefinitely. We propose selling the property. There must be someone willing to take it off your hands. You could move to San Antonio, keep house for us. Arthur is amenable to the arrangement, and we have plenty of room. The girls would love to have their aunt nearby." Margaret read the paragraph 3 times, feeling something cold spread through her chest. They wanted her to give up, to sell the land their father had spent 40 years building, to abandon the house where their mother had died, to come live as an unpaid servant in Josephine's household, because that's what keeping house meant. Not family, not welcome, just another set of hands to mind the children and scrub the floors. She folded the letter carefully, put it back in its envelope, and placed it in the cook stove. Watched it curl and blacken and turn to ash. When she rode out to the Crowe Ranch that Friday, she found Elias in the barn, supervising the shoeing of a big roan stallion. He looked up when she approached, registered something in her expression, and dismissed the farrier with a gesture. What happened? "Nothing that concerns the accounts." I wasn't asking about the accounts. Margaret almost told him it was none of his business, almost maintained the professional distance she'd been carefully preserving for 6 weeks. But something about the way he looked at her, direct, concerned, without pity, broke through her defenses. "My sister wants me to sell the estate and move to San Antonio to keep house for her family. Are you considering it?" "No." "Then why do you look like someone's died?" "Because she didn't ask if I was all right. Didn't ask what I needed. Just assumed I'd be grateful for the offer because, obviously, what else do I have? I'm 34, unwed, taking care of an invalid father. Of course I'd jump at the chance to serve her instead." Elias leaned against the barn wall, arms crossed. "Your sister sounds like a piece of work." Despite everything, Margaret almost smiled. "That's putting it kindly. So tell her no." "I will." "Good." He pushed off the wall. "Come on. There's something I want to show you." He led her out of the barn, past the main house, to a small building she'd noticed before, but never entered. Inside was a workshop. Tools hung neatly on walls, a workbench with several projects in progress, sawdust on the floor. "I come here when I need to think," Elias said. "Working with my hands helps clear my head. Lets me solve problems that seem impossible when I'm just sitting and staring at them." He picked up a piece of wood, ran his fingers along it. "This is going to be a chair. Nothing fancy, just solid and functional. Takes time, takes patience, and you can't rush it or you'll ruin the whole thing." Margaret understood what he was saying. Like managing an estate, like managing anything worth keeping. Your sister sees the work you're doing as drudgery, something to escape from. But it's not, is it? It's building something, preserving something. That has value even if no one else recognizes it. My father recognizes it. I recognize it. He set the wood down and looked at her directly. What you're doing, taking care of him, holding onto the land, refusing to give up even when it would be easier, that takes strength most people don't have. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The words settled into her like warmth, like honey in tea. When was the last time someone had told her she was strong? When had anyone acknowledged that what she was doing mattered? "Thank you," she said quietly. "Nothing to thank me for. Just stating facts." He moved toward the door, then paused. "You're good at what you do, Margaret. The bookkeeping, yes, but more than that. You see things clearly. You don't let emotion cloud your judgment, but you don't lose sight of what matters either. That's rare." After she finished the day's work on the accounts, Elias invited her to stay for lunch. She almost refused, maintaining boundaries, keeping things professional, but she was hungry. And Mrs. Chen had packed only a small lunch, and she was tired of always saying no to small kindnesses. The new housekeeper, Mrs. Valdez, had prepared beef stew and fresh bread. They ate in the kitchen, informal and easy, and talked about ordinary things, the weather, the cattle market, the upcoming harvest. Nothing heavy, nothing complicated. "Tell me something," Elias said as they finished eating. "Why didn't you marry?" "You said you had offers. None that felt right. What would have felt right?" Margaret considered the question. "Someone who saw me as I am, not as they wanted me to be. Someone who understood that I have responsibilities I won't abandon. Someone who—" She stopped, feeling suddenly exposed. Someone who what? Someone who made me want to say yes. She met his eyes. "Why didn't you marry?" "You're successful, established, certainly capable of supporting a family. Because I wasn't ready. I spent my 20s building this ranch, proving I could do what I set out to do. Didn't have time for courting and all that comes with it. And the women who were interested—" He paused. "They were interested in what I had, not who I was." "How did you know the difference?" "Because they stopped being interested once they realized I wasn't going to change for them. Wasn't going to move to Dallas or Houston, wasn't going to give up the ranch for city life, wasn't going to pretend to be something I'm not." Margaret understood that, more than she wanted to admit. How many times had men lost interest once they realized she wouldn't give up her responsibilities, wouldn't abandon her father, wouldn't transform into someone easier to manage? "So we're both too stubborn for our own good," she said, "or just particular about what we're willing to compromise on." He stood, began clearing the dishes. "There's nothing wrong with knowing what you want and refusing to settle. People call that being difficult. People call lots of things, lots of names when they don't understand them." After she left that day, riding Morrison's old mare back through the autumn afternoon, Margaret thought about Elias's workshop, about the chair he was building slowly and carefully, about how some things couldn't be rushed without ruining them, about how maybe, just maybe, she was building something too, not just preserving an estate or maintaining accounts, but creating a life that was hers on her own terms. It might not look like her sisters' lives, might not be what people expected or approved of, but it was real, and it was solid, and it was enough. When she got home, she sat down and wrote a brief letter to Josephine. "Thank you for the offer. I'm staying here. Don't worry about me. I'm exactly where I need to be." She sealed it, addressed it, and set it aside for mailing. Then she went to sit with her father, read to him from the newspaper, fed him his dinner, and felt something like contentment settle over her. She was 34, unwed, managing a failing estate and caring for an invalid father. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel forgotten. She felt seen. Winter came early that year, bringing cold that settled into bones and stayed there. Margaret's father caught pneumonia in December, and for 3 terrible days she thought she was going to lose him. Doc Pritchard came twice a day, and Margaret barely slept, sitting vigil beside the bed, listening to her father's labored breathing and praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening. On the 3rd night, Elias appeared at her door. She answered his knock in her nightdress and wrapper, hair loose around her shoulders, eyes raw from exhaustion and tears. He stood on the porch with a lantern, snow dusting his coat, and didn't say anything at first. Just looked at her with an expression that made her chest tighten. "Mrs. Chen sent word," he said finally. Said you could use company. I'm fine. You're not. Let me in, Margaret. She was too tired to argue. Stepped aside and let him into the cold house. Into the dim hallway that smelled of sickness and medicine and fear. He followed her to her father's room, where Thomas Lane lay pale and still, breathing in shallow gasps that rattled in his chest. Elias stood at the foot of the bed for a long moment, then looked at Margaret. When did you last eat? She couldn't remember. Yesterday, maybe. When did you last sleep? I can't sleep. If I sleep, I might miss. She couldn't finish the sentence. Come on. He took her arm gently. Mrs. Chen and I will sit with him. You're going to eat something and lie down for a few hours. I can't leave him. You're no good to him if you collapse from exhaustion. And you will collapse, Margaret. I can see it in your eyes. He was right. She knew he was right. But leaving felt like giving up, like admitting defeat. Mrs. Chen appeared from the kitchen, a shawl wrapped around her thin shoulders. Go, child, rest. We'll wake you if anything changes. Between the two of them, Margaret didn't have the strength to resist. She let them lead her to the kitchen, let them sit her at the table, let Mrs. Chen put soup in front of her. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing, and then Elias walked her to her small room. 4 hours, he said. That's all I'm asking. 4 hours of sleep, then you can come back. She nodded, too exhausted to speak, lay down on her narrow bed, fully clothed, and was asleep before he closed the door. She woke to dawn light and the smell of coffee. Panic seized her. How long had she slept? And she rushed from the room to find Elias sitting beside her father's bed, reading aloud from the newspaper in his low, steady voice. Her father's eyes were open. His breathing was easier. The terrible rattle was gone. He turned the corner about 2 hours ago, Elias said quietly. Fever broke, breathing eased. Doc Pritchard says he'll make it. Margaret felt her knees go weak with relief. She sank into the other chair, took her father's hand, and finally let herself cry, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for the fear, for the exhaustion, for the months of holding everything together without breaking. Elias didn't try to comfort her or tell her it would be all right. He just sat there, solid and present, and let her fall apart without judgment. When she finally stopped, spent and shaking, he handed her his handkerchief. Better? Yes, thank you. You don't have to thank me for being here. Why are you here? She looked at the clock. 5 in the morning. You should be at your ranch, managing your operation, not sitting vigil with a sick old man you barely know. Because you needed someone, and I wanted it to be me. The simple honesty of it stunned her into silence. I should go, he said, standing. You'll want time with your father. But Margaret, he paused at the door, you don't have to do everything alone. I know you can, but you don't have to. After he left, her father squeezed her hand weakly. She looked at him and saw something in his eyes, understanding maybe, or approval. He couldn't speak well enough to tell her what he thought about Elias Crowe sitting vigil at his bedside, but he didn't need to. The gesture said everything. Over the following weeks, as her father slowly recovered, Margaret found herself thinking more and more about that night, about Elias showing up in the snow, about him sitting through the dark hours, reading aloud to keep a dying man company, about the way he'd looked at her when he said, I wanted it to be me. She'd been telling herself their arrangement was purely professional. Water rights and bookkeeping, nothing more. But that was becoming harder to believe. He'd started staying for lunch on the Fridays she came to work. Sometimes he'd walk her out to her horse afterward and they'd talk. Real conversations about books they'd read, places they'd been, what they wanted from life. She learned he'd grown up in Philadelphia, that his father had been a lawyer who'd expected Elias to follow in his footsteps, that coming west had been an act of rebellion that became a calling. My father died thinking I'd wasted my life, Elias told her one afternoon. Never understood why I'd choose cattle and dirt over contracts and courtrooms. Do you regret it? Not for a second. He gestured to the land around them. This is real. I can see what I build, touch what I create. That matters to me in a way pushing papers never did. Margaret understood that. She'd built something too, even if it was just survival, just holding on. But it was real and it was hers, and no one could take that from her. In January, power of attorney finally came through. The judge in Mercer had been sympathetic, and with Doc Pritchard's testimony about her father's condition, Margaret was granted legal authority to manage the estate. She signed the water rights contract officially, making their arrangement binding and proper. Elias marked the occasion by commissioning the county surveyor to properly map the spring and creek, ensuring there'd be no disputes about boundaries or access. "My grandfather used to say, 'Good fences make good neighbors,'" he told Margaret. "I say clear agreements make good partners. Partners. Not employer and employee, not landowner and tenant. Partners." She stored that word away, turned it over in her mind during quiet moments. February brought a thaw, then more snow, then finally the first hints of spring. Margaret's father continued to improve, still paralyzed on his right side, still unable to speak clearly, but alert and present in a way he hadn't been since the stroke. She read to him every evening, and sometimes caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. One night after she'd finished the newspaper and was preparing to leave him for the night, he caught her hand. Squeezed it hard, harder than he'd been able to manage in months. "Crowe," he said clearly. "Good man." She knew what he was saying, what he was giving her permission for. Her throat tightened. "Yes, Papa, he is. You—" He struggled with the words, face contorting with effort. "Deserve good." It was the most he'd said since the stroke, and the effort left him exhausted. But his eyes held hers, fierce and certain, and Margaret understood. Her father was telling her it was all right to stop being forgotten. All right to let someone see her. All right to want something more than just survival. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "I love you, Papa." He squeezed her hand again, and she knew he understood. That night, lying in her small room, Margaret let herself think about Elias Crowe, really think about him, not as an employer or a business associate or a neighbor, but as a man who'd sat vigil with her father, who'd trusted her with his finances, who'd looked at her in the snow and said he'd wanted to be there. She was 34 years old. She'd spent half her life being practical, being overlooked, being the one who held everything together while others moved on. Maybe it was time to be something else. Maybe it was time to let someone look at her and see not what she could do, but who she was. And maybe, just maybe, Elias Crowe was already seeing exactly that. The letter arrived in March, addressed to Elias Crowe, but delivered to Margaret by mistake. The postal clerk, new and flustered, had mixed up the route deliveries, and Margaret didn't realize the error until she was home and sorting through her mail. The envelope was thick, expensive paper, with a Philadelphia return address and a law firm's name embossed in the corner. She should have set it aside immediately, ridden back to town to return it. But something about it caught her attention. The formal nature of it, the way Elias's name was written in precise legal script. She told herself she was just checking to see if it was urgent. Told herself she'd reseal it if it was something private. She opened it. The letter inside was from Crowe and Associates, attorneys at law. It took Margaret 3 readings to understand what she was looking at. And when she did, something cold settled in her stomach. Elias Crowe, her Elias. The man who'd sat vigil with her father, who'd given her work and respect, and something that felt dangerously like courtship, wasn't just some eastern man who'd come west to ranch. He was heir to one of Philadelphia's largest fortunes. The Crowe family owned railroads, shipping companies, real estate holdings worth millions. The law firm writing to him wasn't a random business. It was his family's firm. And the letter was informing him that his older brother had died, making Elias the sole heir to the entire estate. There was more. According to the letter, Elias's father had died 5 years ago, and his mother 2 years after that. His brother had been managing the family holdings, but a riding accident had left Elias as the last surviving Crowe. The lawyers needed him to return to Philadelphia to settle the estate and take control of the family business. The Texas ranch, the letter made clear, had been purchased with what amounted to pocket change from Elias's trust fund. A diversion, a place to hide while he figured out what he wanted from life. Not the dream he'd told Margaret about. Not a rebellion, just A wealthy man playing at being a cowboy. Margaret sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands and felt everything she'd started to believe crumble into dust. He'd lied to her. Maybe not outright, but by omission, which felt worse. He'd let her think they were similar. Two people building something real with their own hands, choosing substance over show. But he'd been playing a part, and she'd been foolish enough to believe it. The water rights suddenly made terrible sense. $500 a year was nothing to a man worth millions. The bookkeeping job, $50 a month to keep her pride intact while he helped her out of charity. The friendship, the attention, the way he'd looked at her. Was any of it real, or had she been a project to him? A poor relation he'd taken pity on? She thought about the night he'd sat with her father, about every conversation they'd had, every moment she'd let herself hope. Had he been laughing at her the whole time, amused by the spinster who thought she could be a partner to Elias Crowe? Mrs. Chen found her there an hour later, still holding the letter, tears dried on her face. "Child, what's wrong?" Margaret handed her the letter without speaking, watched Mrs. Chen read it, watched her face shift from confusion to understanding. "This changes nothing," Mrs. Chen said finally. "It changes everything, does it? He's still the same man who sat vigil with your father. Still the same man who gave you work when you needed it. Money doesn't change character, but it changes truth. He let me think." She couldn't finish. It hurt too much to say out loud. What did he let you think? That we were equals, that what was growing between us was real. And you think rich men can't have real feelings? I think rich men have choices I'll never have. When this ranch gets boring, he can go back to Philadelphia and live like a king. I'll still be here with 200 acres and a dying father. How is that equal? Mrs. Chen set the letter down carefully. That's fear talking. And maybe some pride. Don't make decisions based on those things. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. She'd been so careful, so guarded, and she'd still let herself be fooled. That Friday, when she arrived at the Crowe Ranch for her usual work, she brought the letter with her. Found Elias in his office going over breeding records, looking exactly like what he was, a wealthy man managing one of his many investments. "This came to my house by mistake," she said. Setting the envelope on his desk, he glanced at it, and something shifted in his expression. "You opened it. I thought it might be urgent. So you read my private correspondence?" "Yes, and now I know why you're really here. Why you've really been—" She stopped, not trusting her voice. Elias stood, came around the desk. "What exactly do you think you know? That you're not who you said you were? That this whole ranch, this whole life, it's just what? A vacation? A way to kill time before you go back to being a Crow of Philadelphia? I never lied to you. You never told me the truth either. Because it didn't matter. The money, the family name, none of that has anything to do with who I am or what I'm building here. It has everything to do with it. You told me you understood what it was like to build something real, to choose this life over an easier one. But you didn't choose anything. You just took a break from being rich. That's not fair. Fair? You want to talk about fair? Margaret felt 8 years of frustration and loneliness, and being overlooked rise up in her throat like bile. I trusted you. I let you into my life, into my father's life. I thought. She stopped again, unable to say what she'd thought. What she'd hoped. What did you think, Margaret? I thought you saw me. Really saw me. Not as a charity case or a convenient employee, but as someone worth— The words caught. Worth knowing. Elias took a step toward her. I do see you. That hasn't changed, but everything else has. Don't you understand? You can leave any time you want. Go back to Philadelphia. Live in mansions. Marry some society woman who fits your real life. And I'll still be here, exactly where I am, exactly who I've always been. Is that what you think I want? Some society woman? I think you have options I'll never have. And I think eventually you'll realize that a woman who takes in mending and sells eggs for grocery money isn't the kind of partner someone like you needs. Someone like me. Elias's voice had gone quiet, dangerously so. You mean someone with money. I mean someone with choices. We all have choices, Margaret. I chose to come here 7 years ago. I chose to build this ranch, to make a life away from my family and their expectations. And I'm choosing, he stopped, jaw tight. I'm choosing what I want, not what's easy or expected. Until you get bored and choose something else, the words hung between them, ugly and accusatory. Elias looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face closed off. I see. You've already decided who I am and what I'll do. Nothing I say will change your mind, will it? Margaret wanted to take it back, wanted to say she was wrong, wanted to let him explain. But the fear was too strong. The old familiar fear of being left behind, of not being enough. I think it's better if I don't work here anymore, she said instead. I'll finish out this month, but after that, you should find someone else. If that's what you want, it's not about what I want. It's about what's practical. Right. Practical, the word came out bitter. That's always been your answer to everything, hasn't it? Keep things practical, keep your distance. Don't let anyone get close enough to hurt you. That's not it is. You're so afraid of being forgotten that you won't let anyone remember you. He picked up the letter, folded it carefully. You can go. I'll make do with the bookkeeping myself. Margaret left without another word, rode home in bright March sunshine that felt like mockery. And when she got there, she went to her room and finally let herself break down completely. She'd done the right thing, the practical thing, protected herself before she could be hurt worse. So why did it feel like she'd just thrown away the one real thing she'd had in years? Mrs. Chen didn't say, "I told you so." She just brought Margaret tea and sat with her while she cried, and that somehow made it worse, because Margaret knew deep down that she'd let fear win, and she didn't know if she'd ever be brave enough to take it back. April arrived with rain that turned the roads to mud and kept Margaret confined to the estate. She threw herself into work, repairs she'd been putting off, spring planting, tending her father, who was improving daily, but still needed constant care. She didn't let herself think about Elias, didn't let herself wonder what he was doing, whether he'd found a new bookkeeper, whether he regretted what had happened between them. She told herself she'd made the right choice, the safe choice. But safe felt a lot like lonely. Her father noticed, of course. He watched her with his sharp eyes, and one evening when she was reading to him, he interrupted with a grunt that meant he wanted to speak. "What is it, Papa?" "Fool," he managed to say. "I'm sorry. You, fool." He pointed at her with his good hand, frustrated at not being able to say more. "I don't understand." He made an exasperated sound and pointed toward the window, toward the west, toward the Crowe ranch. Margaret set down the book. "Papa, it's complicated." "Not," he struggled, "not complicated, simple. You, him, love." The word hit her like a physical blow. "It's not, we're not." But her father's expression said he knew better. He'd seen it somehow, had understood what was growing between her and Elias, even before Margaret had let herself admit it. "He's leaving," Margaret said, "going back to Philadelphia. He has responsibilities there, a whole life I can't be part of." Her father shook his head emphatically, pointed at her again. "Ask. Ask what? Ask him. Stay." "Papa, I can't ask him to give up everything for me. That's not—" "Fool," her father said again, more forcefully. Then with obvious effort, "He chose, here, before chose you, now." Margaret stared at him. "You think he'd stay? For me?" Her father nodded. "But I ruined it. I said terrible things. I accused him of—" "Fix it." Her father squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "Not too late. Fix it." But Margaret didn't know if she could, didn't know if she had the courage to go to Elias and admit she'd been wrong, that fear had made her cruel, that she wanted— What? What did she want? Him. She wanted him, wanted his steady presence and his quiet strength and the way he looked at her like she mattered. Wanted the conversations on his porch and the trust he'd placed in her and the future she'd been too afraid to imagine. She wanted him, and the realization terrified her more than anything else ever had. The next morning, Elizabeth arrived unannounced. Margaret was in the chicken coop when she heard the carriage, and when she came around the house, there was her middle sister, dressed in travelling clothes, stepping down from a hired rig with 2 large cases. "Elizabeth, I wasn't expecting. I know, I should have written ahead." Elizabeth paid the driver and turned to face Margaret, and there was something different about her. A tiredness around the eyes, a tightness in her mouth. "May I come in?" They sat in the parlour, and Margaret made tea, while trying to understand why Elizabeth had suddenly appeared after months of brief telegrams and excuses about trials. "How's father?" Elizabeth asked. "Improving, slowly but steadily. I'm glad. I should have come sooner, I know that." Margaret waited. There was more. She could see it in the way Elizabeth held her teacup, in the way she wouldn't quite meet Margaret's eyes. "James left me," Elizabeth said finally, 3 months ago, for his law clerk, a girl of 23. Margaret set down her own cup carefully. "Lizzie, I'm so sorry." "Don't be." "I'm not. The marriage was a mistake from the start. He wanted a hostess and a pretty ornament. I wanted—" She laughed bitterly. "I don't know what I wanted. Security, I suppose, status. I got both, and they meant nothing. What will you do?" "I don't know. The divorce will be finalized soon. I have some money of my own, a settlement from James, and what Mother left me. I thought I might—" She finally looked at Margaret directly. "I thought I might come home, if you'll have me. Help with father, help with the estate. I know I have no right to ask after—" "Of course you can come home," Margaret said. "This is your home." "It always has been." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "I was awful to you. We all were. You held everything together while we ran off to build new lives, and we never even thanked you. We just assumed you'd always be here, always managing, always forgotten," Margaret finished. "Yes, I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry." Margaret reached across and took her sister's hand. "You're here now. That's what matters." They talked for hours, really talked, maybe for the first time since they were children. Elizabeth told her about the slow death of her marriage, about discovering James's affair, about the humiliation of society gossip, and the relief of finally being free. Margaret told her about the estate's struggles, about their father's stroke, about the water rights arrangement. She didn't tell her about Elias. Not yet. That hurt was too raw, too fresh. But Elizabeth saw it anyway. "There's something else. Something you're not saying." Margaret hesitated, then told her everything, about Elias, about the work arrangement, about what had grown between them, about the letter and the argument, and how she'd ruined it all out of fear. Elizabeth listened, without interrupting, and when Margaret finished, she said, "You love him." "I don't. Margaret, I've made a great many mistakes in my life, and I've learned to recognize them in others. You love him, and you're terrified of what that means. He's going to leave. He has to. His family, his responsibilities. Did he tell you he was leaving?" Margaret thought about it. "No, but the letter said he needed to return to Philadelphia to settle the estate. Settling an estate doesn't mean staying there. People with money hire lawyers for that. Unless—" Elizabeth leaned forward. "Unless he wants to leave. Did he seem like he wanted to leave?" "I don't know. We didn't really discuss it. I just assumed—" "You assumed he'd choose his old life over you, so you pushed him away first, protected yourself. That's what you do when you've been forgotten your whole life. You stop expecting people to stay." "But Margaret—" Elizabeth's voice was gentle. "Maybe it's time to stop protecting yourself and start fighting for what you want." That night, Margaret lay awake thinking about what her sister had said, about fighting instead of protecting, about asking instead of assuming. Her whole life, she'd been practical, sensible. She'd made peace with being overlooked, with settling for less, with managing expectations so carefully that she never risked disappointment. But where had that gotten her? 34, alone, managing a failing estate with no real hope of anything changing. Elias had offered her something different. Not security, she'd never asked for that. Not rescue, she'd never needed that. Just partnership, respect. Someone who saw her clearly and valued what he saw, and she'd thrown it away because she was afraid he'd eventually see what everyone else saw, that she wasn't enough, wasn't worth staying for. But what if she was wrong? What if her father was right and Elias had chosen her already, had been choosing her all along, and she'd been too blind to see it? The next morning, Margaret made a decision. She would go to Elias, apologize, tell him the truth, that she'd been scared, that she'd said things she didn't mean, that if there was any chance he might consider forgiving her, she'd like to try again. She dressed carefully, braided her hair, and was preparing to ride out when Mrs. Chen appeared at her door, slightly out of breath. "Child, you need to come. Quickly. What's wrong? Is it Papa?" "No, it's just come." Margaret followed Mrs. Chen to the front of the house, and what she saw made her heart stop. Elias's wagon was coming up the drive, but he wasn't in it. One of his ranch hands was driving, and in the back were crates and boxes, more than Margaret could count. The wagon pulled up, and the ranch hand tipped his hat. "Morning, Miss Lane. Mr. Crowe sent me with some things, said you'd know what to do with them." "What things?" "Supplies, mostly. Food, tools, building materials. Said something about roof repairs." The young man consulted a paper. "Also sent word that he's hired Ben Morrison to help with spring planting and Lucy Morrison to continue sitting with your father 3 days a week instead of 2. And there's this." He handed Margaret an envelope, her name on the front in Elias's handwriting. Her hands shook as she opened it. "Margaret, I'm leaving for Philadelphia tomorrow. The estate business can't be handled remotely, much as I'd prefer it. I'll be gone for at least 2 months, possibly 3. Before I go, I needed to make sure you and your father would be taken care of. I know you'll object to this as charity, but it's not. Consider it payment for services rendered. You fixed my accounts, saved me thousands in overcharges and theft, and I'm not done thanking you for that. The supplies in the wagon are yours, no strings attached. Ben Morrison is being paid from my accounts, not yours, as is Lucy. You don't need to pay them back. I want you to know something. When I came to Texas 7 years ago, I was running from a life that felt like a cage. Yes, I have money. Yes, I could have done anything, gone anywhere. But I chose here. I chose this life. And that choice had nothing to do with my family or their expectations. It had everything to do with finding something real. You are real, Margaret. The most real thing I've ever known. You accused me of having choices you'll never have. You're wrong. The only choice that matters is whether to be brave enough to reach for what you want, or let fear keep you small. I'm choosing to be brave. I'm going to Philadelphia to close a door I should have closed years ago. When I come back, if I come back, I'm coming back for good. No more ties to that old life. No more obligations pulling me in 2 directions. When I come back, I'm staying. The question is whether you'll let me. Think about it while I'm gone. Yours if you want me, Elias. Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. He was leaving. But not the way she'd thought. He was leaving to come back. For her, for this life, for what they could build together. If she was brave enough to let him. "Mrs. Chen," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "I need to get to town, now, child. I need to send a telegram before he leaves. I need to tell him." She stopped, a sob catching in her throat. "I need to tell him yes." Margaret rode Morrison's mare harder than she'd ever ridden any horse, pushing the old animal to its limits across muddy roads and through fields still wet from April rain. Elizabeth had insisted on coming, riding beside her on the horse they'd borrowed from the Hendersons, both of them racing against time and Margaret's own fear that she was already too late. The train station sat at the edge of Mercer County, a small wooden platform with a telegraph office and a waiting room that smelled of coal smoke and old wood. Margaret could see the train sitting on the tracks, steam rising from the engine, heard the conductor calling final boarding. She dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, nearly tripping over her own skirts as she ran toward the platform. Her eyes scanned the crowd. Farmers heading to market, a family with 3 small children, an elderly couple. There. at the far end of the platform, 1 foot on the train steps, carpet bag in hand. Elias. She called his name without thinking, without caring who heard or what they'd say. Elias, wait. He turned, and the expression on his face, surprise, hope, something that looked like fear, nearly stopped her in her tracks. She ran to him, breathing hard, mud-splattered and wind-blown, and absolutely not caring how she looked. "I got your letter," she said, the words tumbling out. "And I need to tell you, I need to say, Margaret, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did. I have to tell you that I was wrong. About everything. About you, about what you wanted, about what I was worth. I've spent my whole life being practical and careful and protecting myself from disappointment, and all it got me was lonely," the conductor called out again. "All aboard!" But Elias didn't move, just looked at her with those grey eyes that had always seen too much. "I was scared," Margaret continued, her voice shaking. "I've been forgotten by so many people for so long that when you started seeing me, really seeing me, I didn't know what to do with it. So I pushed you away before you could leave me, because that's what I do. That's what I've always done. Margaret, let me finish, please." She took a breath, steadying herself. "You asked me once what would have felt right, what would have made me say yes. And I didn't have an answer then, but I do now. Someone who sees me as I am. Someone who understands that I have responsibilities I won't abandon. Someone who makes me want to be brave instead of safe." She stepped closer, close enough to see the 5 o'clock shadow along his jaw, the way his hands tightened on the carpet-bag handle. "You're all of those things. You're every single thing I was too afraid to let myself want. And if you still mean what you said in that letter, if you're really coming back, then yes. My answer is yes, to all of it. To whatever you're offering, whatever you're willing to give, whatever future you're brave enough to build. I'm saying yes." For a moment, Elias just stared at her. Then he dropped his carpet-bag and pulled her into his arms, and Margaret felt something in her chest that had been locked tight for years finally break open. "I'm coming back," he said against her hair. "I swear to you I'm coming back. I know. I believe you." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands cupping her face. "I need to do this. Close the estate, settle my brother's affairs. But Margaret, I'm not going back to that life. I'm done with Philadelphia and everything it represents. When I come back here, it's for good. This is my home. You're my home." "How long?" She asked because she needed to know, needed to prepare herself for the waiting. 2 months. 3 at most. "And then I'm back and I'm not leaving again." He pressed his forehead to hers. "Can you wait that long? Can you trust me that long?" "I can wait. I've waited 34 years for something real. I can wait a little longer." The conductor called final boarding, more insistent now, and Elias reluctantly stepped back. "I have to go. But I'm writing. Every week, I promise, I'll write back. And when I get home," he paused, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "When I get home, we're going to have a very long conversation about the future. I'll look forward to it." He kissed her then, quick and hard and full of promise. And then he was boarding the train, and Margaret was standing on the platform, watching it pull away, carrying the man she'd finally been brave enough to say yes to. Elizabeth appeared at her shoulder, slightly breathless. Well, that was dramatic. Was it foolish? Probably. But the best things usually are. She linked her arm through Margaret's. "Come on, let's go home and tell Papa. He'll be pleased to know his eldest daughter finally stopped being practical." Margaret laughed, wiping tears from her cheeks. "I'm not sure I know how to be anything else." "Then you'll have 3 months to learn." They rode home through the April afternoon, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt something that had been missing for so long, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Hope, pure, uncomplicated hope for a future that was still being written. The letters came weekly, like clockwork. Long letters full of details about Philadelphia, the estate settlement, the lawyers, the society people who couldn't understand why he'd chosen Texas over the family business. But mostly they were about missing her, about counting days until he could come home, about plans for the future he wanted them to build together. Margaret wrote back just as faithfully. She told him about the spring planting, about her father's continued improvement, about Elizabeth settling into life at the estate and proving remarkably competent at managing the household. She told him small things, how the chickens were laying well, how she'd finally fixed the roof leak in the east bedroom, how she'd started teaching Lucy Morrison to read during the afternoons when her father napped. She told him about missing him, though it felt strange to write such things. She wasn't practiced at vulnerability, at admitting she needed someone. But with each letter, it got easier. 10 weeks passed, then 11. On the first day of July, Margaret received a telegram, arriving Tuesday. Everything settled. Coming home for good. Tuesday was 3 days away. The estate erupted into controlled chaos. Elizabeth took charge of cleaning the house top to bottom. Mrs. Chen baked and cooked enough food to feed an army. Margaret's father, now able to sit in his chair on the porch for hours at a time, supervised everything with his good eye and occasionally grunted directions. No one quite understood, but everyone pretended to follow. Margaret tried to help, but mostly just got in the way. Too nervous to focus on any single task. What if he'd changed his mind? What if Philadelphia had reminded him of everything he was giving up? What if, "Child," Mrs. Chen said firmly on Monday night, catching Margaret pacing the kitchen for the 10th time. "Stop borrowing trouble. He said he's coming. He's coming. But what if, no what ifs, you've spent enough time on those. Tomorrow, you're going to put on your best dress, fix your hair, and trust that what you built with that man is strong enough to survive a few months apart." Margaret did as she was told. Tuesday morning, she dressed in her good blue dress, the one her mother had made years ago, altered and mended but still beautiful. Elizabeth helped with her hair, pinning it up in a style that was elegant without being fussy. "You look lovely," Elizabeth said, stepping back to admire her work. "I look nervous. You look like a woman about to see the man she loves after 10 weeks apart." "A little nervous is appropriate." Margaret went to sit with her father on the porch, both of them watching the drive, waiting. The train wasn't due until 2 o'clock, which meant Elias wouldn't arrive until 3 at the earliest. But Margaret couldn't make herself go inside and occupy herself with work. Her father reached over and patted her hand with his good one. "Nos." "Good man," he said, clearer than before, the speech improving every week. "Proud of you. Papa should have told you sooner. You deserve happy." The words came slow but strong. "Your mama would approve." Margaret's throat tightened. "You really think so?" "No, so. She wanted all her girls to find love, real love. Not just security." He squeezed her hand. "You found it." At 3:30, Margaret saw dust rising in the distance. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. The rider came into view, Elias on the big bay gelding, sitting easy in the saddle like he'd never left. He'd been gone 10 weeks, and in that time, Margaret had convinced herself she'd built him up in memory, that the reality wouldn't match what she'd remembered. She was wrong. He was exactly as she remembered, tall and solid and real. With those grey eyes that found hers the moment he dismounted, he walked toward the porch, not rushed but purposeful, and Margaret stood to meet him. Her father grunted something that sounded approving and pushed himself up with his cane, patting Elias's shoulder as he passed by into the house, giving them privacy. "Hello," Elias said, and just hearing his voice again made something in Margaret's chest loosen. "Hello, how was Philadelphia?" "Finished, settled, done. I sold everything except the trust funds I can't touch and set up management for those through lawyers. No more ties, no more obligations pulling me back. That must have been difficult. It was necessary. I've been half-living for too long. 1 foot here, 1 foot there. I'm done with that. I'm here now, fully here, and I'm not going anywhere." He took her hands in his. "Unless you've changed your mind." "I haven't." "Good, because I came back to ask you something, and I'd like to do it properly." And then, to Margaret's absolute shock, Elias Crowe, the most powerful cattle baron in Texas, heir to millions, a man who'd never knelt for anyone, went down on one knee in the dust of her crumbling driveway. "Margaret Lane, I'm not good with pretty words, but I know what I want, and I know what matters. You matter." You're brave and strong and real, and you see the world clearly without letting it make you bitter. I love you. I want to build a life with you, here on this land that matters to both of us. I want to wake up next to you and work beside you and grow old watching the sun rise over these fields. Will you marry me? Margaret looked down at him, this proud, complicated man who'd chosen to kneel for her, and felt every defense she'd ever built crumble to nothing. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. He stood and pulled her into his arms. And Margaret let herself be held, let herself be seen, let herself believe that this was real and lasting and hers. The most powerful cowboy in Texas had knelt for the eldest spinster, and she'd been brave enough to say yes. They were married in August on the front lawn of the Lane estate, under oak trees that had stood for 100 years. It was a small ceremony. Doc Pritchard, Mrs. Chen, Elizabeth, Ben Morrison and his family, a handful of Elias's ranch hands. Margaret's father sat in his chair of honor, tears streaming down his face, able to say, "I do," when the minister asked who gave the bride away. Caroline sent a telegram of congratulations from Dallas. Josephine sent nothing at all. Margaret didn't mind. The people who mattered were there. She wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit. Elizabeth had woven wildflowers into her hair. Elias wore a new suit but his old boots, and when he took her hand to slip on the ring, a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother, his hands were shaking. "Nervous," she whispered. "Terrified," he whispered back. "I've been shot at, thrown from horses, caught in stampedes. This is scarier than all of that," she smiled. "We'll be all right." "I know. That's what terrifies me. That you're trusting me to not ruin this. We won't ruin it. We'll build it, same as everything else, one day at a time." After the ceremony, they had dinner on the porch. Mrs. Valdez had outdone herself with roast beef and potatoes and 3 kinds of pie. They ate and talked and laughed as the sun set over the western fields, painting everything gold and amber. Margaret's father pulled her aside before the evening ended, walking slow with his cane but walking on his own. "Happy?" he asked. "Very. Good. Your mama would have—" He paused, gathering words. "Would have loved him. Loved seeing you." Another pause. "Loved seeing you brave. I learned it from you, Papa. You never gave up on this place even when everyone said you should. Different kind of brave. You chose your heart. That's harder. Prouder of you than you know." He kissed her forehead and let Elizabeth help him back inside, leaving Margaret and Elias alone on the porch as stars began to appear overhead. "Your father's improved remarkably," Elias said, his arm around her shoulders. "He's got reason to. Elizabeth's here, I'm settled, the estate is secure. He can finally rest. We'll need to make some decisions soon. About the properties, how to manage both. I've been thinking about that. What if we combined them? Your ranch and my land. Make it one operation, one legacy." "I was hoping you'd say that." Elias pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I had lawyers draw this up. Partnership agreement. 50-50 ownership of combined properties, shared decision-making, everything equal. We build this together, or we don't build it at all." Margaret took the paper, scanned it in the fading light. He'd thought of everything: protections for her inheritance, provisions for her father's care, stipulations that the original Lane property would always stay in the family name. It was fair and thorough and exactly what she would have written herself if she'd known how. "You really meant what you said about equals," she said. "I always mean what I say. Took you long enough to believe me." She laughed. "I'm a slow learner when it comes to trust. Then I'll just have to keep proving myself until you're convinced." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the night settle over land that was now theirs together. Margaret thought about the woman she'd been just a year ago, bitter, forgotten, certain that life had passed her by. She thought about everything that had changed, everything she'd learned about herself. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me. For being patient while I learned to see myself. You always saw yourself, Margaret. You just didn't think anyone else would see what you saw. But I did. From the first moment on this porch, I saw exactly who you were. Strong and honest and real. Everything I'd been looking for without knowing it. 3 months later, on a cold November morning, Margaret's father died peacefully in his sleep. They buried him beside his wife in the small cemetery behind the church, and half the county came to pay respects. Thomas Lane had been a stubborn, proud man, but he'd been fair and decent, and people remembered that, at the graveside, Margaret stood between Elias and Elizabeth and felt a kind of peace settle over her. Her father had lived long enough to see her settled, to know the estate would continue, to give his blessing to the life she'd built. That was enough. That was everything. 6 months after that, in early spring, Margaret stood on the porch of what was now the Lane Crowe ranch and watched morning break over land that stretched as far as she could see. 15,000 acres of prime Texas grassland, running 5,000 head of cattle, employing 30 men and their families. A legacy built from 2 failing operations and 1 chance meeting. Elias came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "How strange life is. A year and a half ago I was 34 and forgotten. Now I'm 36 and unforgettable?" She laughed. I was going to say happy. But unforgettable works too, definitely unforgettable. "I've tried." He kissed the side of her neck. "Believe me, I've tried." She turned in his arms to face him. "Any regrets? About Philadelphia, about what you gave up?" "Not for a second. I gave up nothing real. I gained everything that matters." He touched her face gently. "You taught me that the only thing worth having is what you build with your own hands. With someone who sees you clearly and chooses you anyway. We chose each other. Best decision I ever made." They stood together as the sun rose fully, warming the land, promising another day of work and purpose and the kind of life that mattered. Margaret thought about her younger self, the woman who'd believed she was destined to be forgotten. She wished she could go back and tell that woman what waited ahead, that being overlooked was sometimes just preparation for being truly seen. The most powerful cowboy in Texas had knelt for the eldest spinster. But it wasn't because she'd needed rescuing. It was because he'd recognized her strength, valued her courage, and understood that some matches are worth waiting for. They'd waited. They'd chosen. They'd built something real, and they were just getting started.